Continuing through Israel's history in the Old Testament, I wish I had time to do all of the stories in detail, like cover one a week, but I cover several a week, and just kind of skimming, giving you a summary of these things. And as we've been looking at the monarchy, the period of Israel's history, Saul is the first king under the united monarchy. David has been anointed king, but he has not taken the throne yet. Meanwhile, we have been looking at David's relationship to Saul. And last week, we demonstrated that David's years as Saul's aide. He served Saul in a military capacity, first as his armor bearer, then as kind of a chief of staff or secretary of defense, and then the chief of Saul's bodyguard. He was in charge of 1,000 men. And David also had a musical capacity as Saul's aide, and he was the one who played the lyre or a harp type of instrument while Saul was tormented by an evil spirit thrust on him by the Lord. So this week we're going to look at David's years as Saul's adversary. You remember when we left off last week, David had fled from Saul for the last time. He no longer served at the palace. And where did he go? Well, he went to Nob. David came to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. Now, when the Bible in the Old Testament refers to the priest, he's not saying that Ahimelech is the only priest, but that Ahimelech is the high priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, "Why are you alone and nobody with you?" Why would he say such a thing? Because David always had his men with him. Remember, he was in charge of 1,000 men, and he was the chief of the bodyguard. And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king," he lies, "has charged me with a matter." And he said to me, "Don't let anybody know about the matter of which I send you, and with which I have charged you. And I have made an appointment with the young men," in other words, all those who are in my charge, "and I'm going to meet them at such and such a place." So he's lying to the high priest. And then he says, "What do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here." Now this may give us an indication that David probably had 4 servants with him, because he wants 5 loaves of bread. And the priest answered David, "I don't have any common bread at hand, but there is holy, sanctified, consecrated bread." And where would that be? Well, that would be in the tabernacle, in the table of showbread. Remember, they put out 12 loaves every Sabbath, unleavened bread. And every Sabbath it was replaced with fresh loaves. And usually it was the priest and the priest alone that ate them when they had to be replaced. If only your young men have kept themselves from women. In other words, not defiled. So David answered the priest, "Of course, women have been kept from us as always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is just a common journey. How much more today would their vessels be holy, because this is a special mission?" So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread in there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day when it is taken away, usually a Sabbath. Now, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg the bounty hunter. This Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. And David said to Ahimelech, "Do you not have a spear or a sword here? For I have brought neither sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." And the priest said, well, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it's wrapped here in a cloth behind the ephod. And if you'll take that, take it, for there's nothing but that here. And David said, and there's none like it. Give it to me. Now, David rose and he fled that day away from Saul, and he went to Achish, the king of Gath. Does this make any sense? Who is at war with Israel? The Philistines. Gath is a major Philistine city. Achish is a king of the Philistines, one of the 5 lords of the Philistines. And who else is from Gath? You ought to have it this week, folks. Goliath. The people from Gath are probably not happy with David because he killed one of their own, and he's got 4 more brothers there that live in Gath. And when he gets there, the servants of Achish, the king, said, is this not David, the king of the land? Folks, is David the king yet? No. But even the Philistines know that God has anointed David to be the next king of Israel. And don't they sing to one another of David and dances? Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be a nutcase in their hands, and made marks on the door of the gate and let his drool run down his beard. And there he is acting like a madman. Now, let me review with you geographically where David has been. Look over on the east side of the map over there. On the far east side, about in the middle, you're going to see Gibeah. That's Saul's hometown. That's where the palace is. That's where Saul lives. That's where David was serving him. And he flees from Gibeah. Where does he head? Well, head down a little bit toward the edge of the map. You see the word Nob there. That's where the tabernacle of the Lord was. That's where they had the sacrifices. That's where the high priest and all the priesthood served. You know what was not there? The Ark of the Covenant. Remember, the Philistines had captured it a few decades earlier, and it was still over there at Kiriath Jearim. It has not been joined up with the rest of God's tent. So, David flees from Nob all the way over there to the southwest corner of the map, which is where Gath is, which is in the area that the Philistines commanded. So that's a long way away. Just wanted you to know where he's been and where he's going. So David departed from Achish in Gath, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. Now, how many brothers does David have? He has 7 brothers. And the oldest 3 do what? They're part of Saul's standing army. What do? They go AWOL. They desert their king. Instead, they align themselves with the next king of Israel, who is their little brother. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to David, and he became a captain over them. Now, folks, I have listened to pastors gripe about the people in their church and about, what they're capable of doing and how intelligent or not intelligent they are. And folks, if God brings people to you, he can get the job done with the people that he brings to you. Does David complain about the crew that is assembled? No. Will they give him trouble? Oh yeah, they'll give him trouble. We'll see some of that. But this is what the Lord brought David. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, Please let my father and my mother stay with you until I know what God will do for me. And he left. David had no idea that this period is going to last 7 years as he flees from Saul. So David left his parents there with the king of Moab. Now, why would the king of Moab be partial to David? Well, probably a couple of reasons. Israel had been at war with Moab, and Saul had, by the Lord's hand, defeated the Moabites and kept them over there on the side of the river where they're supposed to be, on the southeast portion of the Dead Sea. I'll show you that in just a second. And he figures David is an enemy of Saul, so the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. And not only that, who's David's great-grandmother? Ruth. And Ruth was a Moabite. So David's got a few things going for him there. And so the prophet Gad, now David's got a bunch of men, 400 about this time. It's going to expand to 600. He's going to have the high priest here in just a few minutes, but he also has a prophet with him whose name is Gad. And Gad says, do not remain in the stronghold over here, but go back into the land of Judah. So David departed and went back into the forest of Hereth. Now let me see if I can show you. Gibeah up there is really Gibeah. And head down to the west side of the Dead Sea, and you see Ziph and Horesh and the desert of Maon. David's going to be spending a lot of time there. Notice the word Keilah, the city of Keilah. We're going to get to an important story there in just a second. David's going to make a side trip to Keilah. But before he gets over there, way over there on the east side of the map, you'll see a river that flows into the Dead Sea. Everything from there down to the corner of the map is the land of Moab. And that's where David has been. So, Dog, the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul when he got back to Gibeah, said, I'm a little tattletale, and I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, who was the grandson of Eli. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and he gave him provisions, and he gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. So what does Doeg say that the high priest did for David? 3 things. He inquired of the Lord for him. Because if you had some questions concerning the Lord's will for the nation or for important people, you went to the high priest and he asked the Lord, yes or no. And so David was asking Ahimelech for advice from the Lord. He also gave him provisions, he gave him something to eat, and he gave him the sword of Goliath. Now, if you're Saul and you are a madman, what would you think? Ahimelech has deserted me, and he's on David's side. He's not on my side. On whose side is the high priest supposed to be? The Lord's. He doesn't work for the king. He works for the Lord. And so the king sent to summon Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all of his father's house. So all of the priests who were there at Nob, they end up traveling 6 or 7 miles up the road to Gibeah, and all of them came to the king. And the king did not like Ahimelech's version of the story, and he's just plain raging mad, and he's looking for somebody to punish because he is not a happy man, and he's going to take it out on somebody. So he instructs Doeg, the Edomite, turn and fall on the priests. And Doeg, the Edomite, turned, and he fell on the priests, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. And Nob, 6 or 7 miles away, the city of priests, Saul put to the sword, and he killed both men and women and children and nursing infants and oxen, donkeys and sheep, and he put them all to the sword. He absolutely destroyed everything that was living in the town of Nob because his wrath was so great. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped, and he fled after David. So now David has a prophet. He's got 400 soldiers with him, and he's got the high priest, the new high priest, because his daddy is dead. Now they told David, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah. Do you remember I told you to pay attention to Keilah on the map up there? And they're robbing the threshing floors. Now what's David doing? He's trying to hide from Saul. And he knows that if he goes out to this battle to help the Judeans in the town of Keilah, that Saul will find out about it and he'll be discovered. And so David inquired of the Lord because he really wants to help his fellow people from the tribe of Judah. Shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. And folks, in order to do the job that God wants us to do, sometimes we have to take a risk that may be dangerous to us to complete our service to God. And David, who wants what God wants, is willing to take that risk. So he goes up there and he beats up on the Philistines and he saves the town. Yay! And the men from Keilah say, live with us for a while. So David dwells in Keilah. And it was told King Saul that David had come to Keilah. And Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. In other words, all we got to do is guard the gate. He can't get out because it's all walls. We've got him surrounded. And Saul summoned all the people to go to war and to go down to Keilah and to besiege David and his men. Well, David finds out what Saul's plan is, and he says, O Lord, God of Israel, your servant surely has heard that Saul is coming here to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, God of Israel, I plead with you. Tell me, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he's coming down. And David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they're going to surrender you. Wow, how's that for gratitude? You save the town from the Philistines, and they're going to turn you over to King Saul so King Saul can put you to death and all of your men. No gratitude whatsoever. And so David has to leave Keilah. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give David into Saul's hand. Keep that in mind. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. You remember that? That's down toward the west of the Dead Sea. And Jonathan, Saul's son, got up and he went down to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. Now, does this make any sense at all? Because if King Saul dies, humanly speaking, who will get to be the next king? Saul's son, Jonathan. But how does Jonathan react? This is 2 or 3 years into David's fleeing from Saul. This is David's best friend. This is another man after God's own heart, because he's not concerned with his own advancement or his own agenda or what's going to be best for him, but what does God want? And Jonathan knows that God wants David to be king. How do we know? Because he said so. And Jonathan said to David, don't be afraid, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I'll be next to you. I'm going to be your vice president. I'm going to be standing there with you, man. And Saul, my father, knows this. Isn't that amazing? Everybody knows that David is going to be the next king. And some people, like Saul, resent it. And some people, like Jonathan, revel in it, and they rejoice. Why? because this is what God wants. Let's get on God's side. And when Saul heard that David had moved over to En-Gedi, En-Gedi is right along the west coast of the Dead Sea. Not a very pretty area, folks. Really, really dry and rocky. And when Saul heard that, he pursued David into the wilderness of Maon. And Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David is hurrying to get away from Saul, and Saul and his men are closing in on David. So just, kind of picture them. They're going around the mountain, and Saul's army is getting closer to David's army. And just as he's about to overtake David, a messenger comes to King Saul and says, "You better hurry up and come, for the Philistines have made a raid upon the land." And so Saul returned from pursuing after David, and he went up against the Philistines. Therefore, the place was called the Rock of Escape. Now, who do you think orchestrated that attack by the Philistines and sent the messenger just in the nick of time to get Saul off of David's tail? Once again, the Lord has preserved his own. Okay, so that's where we are. And Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and he went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Goats Rocks. This is over near En-Gedi. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now, that can have a number of meanings. Saul may have gone in the cave to go to the bathroom. He may have gone in the cave just to take a nap. He may have gone in the cave just to relieve himself from the heat of the day. That's a hot part of Israel, believe me. And David and his men were sitting in the innermost part of the cave. So how many men does David have now? He has 600 men at this time. That must be a pretty big cave. And think about this. If anybody outside in the pursuing army of 3,000 men know that David and his men are in there, what do they got to do? All they got to do is cover the entrance with rocks and starve them to death. Okay? This is a very dangerous place for David to be. And the men of David said to him, this is the day which the Lord has said to you, behold, I am giving your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good for you to do. And David got up, and he sneaks over to Saul, and he cuts off the bottom of Saul's robe, the skirt. I told you guys, never wear a skirt. This will happen to you. And afterward, David's heart smote him, because he had cut off the skirt of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. But David, you're the Lord's anointed. Yup, but he has not given me the office of the king right now. Right now, it is still in the hands of the Lord's anointed, King Saul. And I'm not going to put forth my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words, and he did not permit them to attack Saul while he was in the cave. And Saul finally got up, left the cave, and went on his way. Now, if you were David, what would you do? Whew, man, glad that's over. Let's wait till these guys leave. No, not David, because David trusts the Lord. David also got up, and he went out of the cave, and he called after Saul, my Lord the king. Now, with those words, what is David communicating? Saul, you are still my king and my master, and I have a responsibility to be respectful and submissive to you. That's what he says. Biden is my president. And right now, King Saul is David's king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed his face to the earth and did obeisance. And David said to Saul, "Why are you listening to the voices of men who are saying, 'Behold, David seeks you harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand in the cave, and some of my men said that I should kill you, but I spared you. Because I said, I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed." What is David's governing principle? I've got to look at things from God's perspective, and he is the Lord's anointed as king. And in saying these words, he is telling Saul, Saul, I am not your enemy. I am not seeking to replace you. I am not seeking your harm. I am here to serve you, even though you have done me wrong. So Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Remember, he has lucid moments. He's not always a madman, just when that demon comes upon him. And he said to David, "You are more righteous than I, you think? For you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands." Now, folks, there are going to be people who come into your life who do you wrong. And later on, you may be in a position to repay them for what they did to you. And God has brought them into your life. Does that mean he wants you to seek your own vengeance? No. He's testing you, just like he tested David. And he's showing Saul that the words that he had said decades earlier, "I am replacing you with a man who is better than you," will ring true in Saul's ears. So Saul continues, "If a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done for me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king." Isn't that something? Now, if Saul were really a godly man and in his right mind, wouldn't he just say, "I'm stepping down from being king because I'm not accomplishing much, and I know that you're God's choice and you are a better man than I"? He says, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. "Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore this to Saul, and Saul went home. You think Saul's done chasing him yet? No. Now, at this point of the narrative, Sammy dies, the prophet, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. This is getting near the end of the time where David is fleeing from Saul. And it was during this time that David has that encounter that we read about this morning with Nabal, and his men had encamped around Nabal's shepherds and his sheep, and he guarded them from people stealing the sheep, and they themselves didn't take any of Nabal's sheep, and they probably helped the shepherds to ward off predators like lions and bears or something like this. He was very good to Nabal, and all he asked was for something to eat so they could celebrate one of the religious holidays. And Nabal, the ornery fella, says, "No way." And David said, "Everybody, get your swords on. We're going to teach this fella a lesson." But Nabal had that very discerning wife named Abigail. And she got wind of this, and she sought to protect her husband. Was her husband worthy of that protection? No. But God had made Nabal the fool her lord for that time of her life. And she was going to do what was right. But you also remember that she testifies, I know, David, that you are going to be prince over God's people, Israel. Anyway, I would like you women at some point in life to go ahead and download Nancy Lee DeMoss's teaching on Abigail as she talks about how a woman ought to approach a man who needs correcting. She doesn't come up and put her finger in David's face and say, David, you shouldn't be seeking vengeance. That's not right. No, she talks to David as though David has already made that decision in his heart, because she knows David to be a good man. And far be it from Abigail to tell her future king what he ought to do. And David, the tender soul, responds to this woman who has discretion. And he gives credit both to her and to the Lord for restraining his act of vengeance. David heard that Nabal was dead, and he said, Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from evil. The Lord has returned the evil doing of Nabal upon his own head. Now, folks, there are lots of people who have wronged you in life. Trust that God is going to take care of it in his time. I know we live in an age of fast food and instant gratification, and we want the Lord to do it right now. The Lord will do it in his time and in his way, and in a way that is far better than any of us could think up. So, the Lord has returned the evil doing of Nabal upon his own head, and then David sent and spoke to Abigail to make her his wife. Oh yeah? Just because you're going to be the next king of Israel, you think that I want to marry you? Quick, let me get my stuff together. And she heads right on out there and marries him right away. Now, David had also taken Ahinoam of Jezreel, that's a little bit southwest of the Sea of Galilee, and both of them became his wives. Meanwhile, you remember that first gal that he had married, Saul's daughter, Michal? Well, Saul, in order to get David back, and Michal for betraying him, gave her to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Galim. Now, if you guys have been reading ahead, you'll know that a few years from now, David gets her back. All right. Now, David and Abishai. Abishai is David's nephew. He's got 3 nephews that serve with him. Job, who becomes the commander of David's army, Asahel, his brother, and Abishai. And even though these guys are related to David, they are the sons of his sister, Zeruiah, they are not made of the same stuff that David is. And so they went and heard that Saul's army was nearby, so they sneaked over to Saul's army at night, and there Saul lay sleeping within the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. And Abner, he's the commander of Saul's army, and the army was all asleep all around him. And Abishai says to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. And he says, now please let me pin him to the ground with one stroke of my spear. I won't need to do it twice. Why does he say, let me do it? Because he knows David's not going to do it. Because you remember back at the cave, David wouldn't do it? Well, if you ain't got the guts, David, I do. We can solve this problem. I'm tired of running away from Saul year after year after year. I want to settle down too. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put his hand out against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he'll just go down to the battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now his spear that's at his head and that jar of water, and let's go back to our camp. So there he is, restraining Abishai while Saul sleeps. And David calls out to Abner, wakes him up, "Are you not a man? Who's like you in Israel, General Abner? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done, you fell asleep and failed to protect him, is not good. And as the Lord lives, you, Abner, deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your Lord, the Lord's anointed." David keeps coming back to his reason for preserving Saul. It's God's will. And now see where the king's spear is and the jar of water that was at his head. And Saul said, "I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no longer do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly," you think, "and made a big mistake." And David answered and said, "Here's the spear, O king. Let one of your young men come over here and get it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness, not for taking things into his own hands. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed." And Saul said to David, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things, and you will succeed in them." And David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. Have you ever noticed that David never, ever lost a battle, even after he becomes king? Saul knows that his success against the Philistines was due largely to his son Jonathan and to his servant David. You would think that Saul would be scared to death of David, because the Lord has made David successful at every battle. You want to mix it up with David, you're going to suffer the fate of Goliath, the giant. It's not going to go well with you. So David got up, and he went over, he and his 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, the king of Gath. Well, wait a minute. Wasn't he there earlier in the story, pretending he's a madman? Oh, sorry, king. Temporary insanity. Now, why does he go over there? And I'll review this with you next week. In those days, armies, especially if they were outnumbered or they weren't sure of their own strength, would hire mercenaries who were foreigners to come in and help them do battle. And David is offering himself to the Philistines, he and his 600 men, as mercenaries. But he's got some tricks up his sleeve, and we'll discuss that next week. So David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men. How many? 600. And every man with his household. Oh, these guys have brought their wives and their children too. And David with his 2 wives. Poor guy. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, Saul no longer sought to kill David. And so ends David's years as Saul's adversary. We're getting close to Saul's death, and we'll get to that next week. All right, some things I'd like to point out about these many stories. This man after God's own heart, who's that? David, is far from perfect. First of all, he ends up telling a lie to Ahimelech, the high priest. You remember that story? I'm on a special assignment, secret assignment from the king. David also lied to Achish, the king of Gath, by pretending that he's a nutcase. And he lied. Folks, lying is not trusting. Who do you not trust when you lie? You don't trust God. We lie, we say we lie to protect somebody else's feelings. We don't want to hurt your feelings, so we lie. A lady boss of mine asked me one time, you like my new haircut? And her cousin and I stood there and said, it makes you look like a man. I should have lied to her, protected her feelings. This is a woman who had already threatened to fire me. I can't tell you how many times. When you're lying, you're trying to protect yourself. If you've done something wrong, you don't want anybody to know about it, so you lie because you want to seem good in their eyes. Folks, trust God. If you've done something wrong, admit to it. Suffer the consequences. If you haven't, tell the truth. Leave the results to God. Trust Him, because lying is not trusting. David sought to avenge an insult. How many times did David refuse to avenge himself on all the wrong that Saul had done to him? Why? Because he pictured Saul as somebody who was a station above him. He was the Lord's anointed. Well, how come he's different with Nabal? Because he considers Nabal as somebody beneath him. What's the key? What's the solution to that? Philippians chapter 2. Let each of us consider others to be better or more important than ourselves, even if they have done us wrong. David sought to avenge an insult, and he was going to kill not only Nabal, but all of the males in his house. But if God can use a man as imperfect as he, God can use a people as imperfect as we. So don't get discouraged, folks. As long as you're getting better, because God is looking more at the direction of your life than the perfection of your life. And no matter where you are on that road, God can use you, because He used David. And until God is finished with His servants, He preserves them from harm. Isn't that what God did with David? Was he not continually in danger from Saul? And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give David into Saul's hands. Why? Because He has a plan and He has purpose for David. And until God is finished with that plan and purpose for David, He's going to keep him alive. You remember the other incident when Saul is chasing him around the mountain and intervenes just in time with a messenger. Saul, you're needed over here. The Philistines are attacking. God knows how to deliver the righteous. If He's got a plan and a purpose for your life, you don't need to walk around in fear that something like an epidemic or a car or somebody else is going to kill you, because He's going to keep you alive as long as He has a plan and a purpose for your life. And if He does kill you early, that's part of His plan, and it's not necessarily part of His punishment. Jesus had some apostles. Do you know how many of the apostles were killed before they grew old? All of them except for John. And you know who died first of the apostles? James, John's brother. He was a young man when Herod took his head. Had James done something wrong? No. God's plan and His purpose for James was done. And it was time to take him home. So why are we so intent on preserving our lives? Because I promise you, you're not going to die until God says so. And when it's not God's time, you can't speed it. And when it is God's time, you can't stop it. So why don't you be like David? Just be about the business of what God wants you to be doing, and leave the longevity of life to him, because you can't thwart his plan. Now, a life with a different focus than God is going to be a life that is filled with frustration because things aren't going right. And you're going to walk around with a puss on your face, and you're going to try to make everybody else in your life pay for your discontentment and frustration. Does that sound like anybody in our story? King Saul. But David's focus was God. David wanted what God wanted, even if it meant hardship for David. And so he was a happy man. But Saul was a very frustrated man. Look what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. For to the man who pleases him, that is God, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. What's your life like? But to the sinner, he gives the work of gathering and heaping only to give it to the one who pleases God. This is vanity and striving after wind. You won't even get to enjoy it. Saul, busy building his empire and trying to preserve his own life and his own power, ends up giving it all to David, who is a man after God's own heart. God preserves his servants from sin sometimes. You remember how God preserved David from taking vengeance on Nabal? And he used a woman. In those days, you didn't listen to a woman. They were inferior. But David takes correction well because he's humble. And he said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to intercept me. Blessed be your discretion because of the way that you approached me. And blessed be you who have kept me this day from bloodshed and from working salvation with my own hand." He also gives credit to the Lord. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. King David was able to take correction and admit when he had made a mistake. David trusts God enough to wait for God's timing. God, am I ever going to be king? Am I ever going to be king? You anointed me when I was a teenager, and I have been serving you and Saul, and I'm getting repaid evil for evil, and this is getting really hard. Am I ever going to be king? But David doesn't take things into his own hands. He trusts God enough to wait for God's timing. And if you humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, in due time, he will exalt and reward you too. Just be patient with God. David trusts God enough to wait for God's timing. And then there's a son of David, Jesus, trusts God the Father enough to wait for God's timing. What did God the Father promise Jesus? You're going to be the king of the world. And you just sit here and be patient until I put all of your enemies under your feet. And David could have said, or Jesus could have said, hey, I've earned this. I paid for it. I paid for it with my life. I deserve it. Why do I have to wait for it? Do you have dreams in your life? Aspirations? Hopes? That you think that you've earned, that you've paid for, that you deserve? You don't, but you probably think that. Trust God enough. If he wants you to have it, he's going to exalt you. And one day, our glorious King will get to sit on David's throne. And he will be king not only of Israel, but of all the nations. King of kings, Lord of lords, because he trusts God the Father enough to wait for God's timing.